Hello and welcome to Earthcast, a platform for discussions about bridging the resource gap between people and planet. I am Olivia Taylor, or Olivia Earth on the socials, your host, and I will be interviewing a series of change makers, thinkers and disruptors, and asking them about their areas of expertise. Together, we will discover fresh perspectives and the most useful levers in society for change. The main question that we will explore is how are trade-offs made between people, planet and profit? More specifically, how do we solve wicked problems and make decisions at the margin? If you would like to hear more from Earthcast, subscribe to the podcast and follow us on social media. Hello and welcome back. Today we're speaking to Roushanna Gray, who is the founder of Veld and Sea, an immersive and experiential wild flavour-focused business. The concept of Veld and Sea is to track the edible landscape through the seasons, with workshops that invite others to experience what nature's flavour of the moment is. In summer, coastal foraging, in autumn and winter, land-based harvesting, and in the springtime, the focus moves to flowers. Roushanna's workshops are based in Cape Town, and I've been incredibly privileged to join a few, including my favourite, which was the coastal forage, where we actually got into the water and free dived and were able to collect things out of the ocean. So Roushanna, in a nutshell, how did you start doing what you do? And what in particular piqued your interest?
It was a hobby, I guess, and then a lifestyle, and I suppose an expansion of joy. It started off with a simple cup of wild herbal tea and ended up with a world of unending doors of knowledge that was just waiting to be unlocked. And I think the thing that was most interesting to me was how much we don't really know about our natural environment, and that a beautiful learning tool or a connector that we can all relate to is food. I personally don't have a very academic mind or background, but I personally learn from experiential learning, the act of actually doing something. And this is what Veld and Sea workshops are all about. And this is my method of teaching.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And, for those who don't have gardens, for example, how can those sorts of people get more engaged in nature and learn about wild plants?
It's a great question. Gardens are the best place to start. There are so many edible weeds growing in everybody's back gardens. If you don't have a garden, then you can start forming a little relationship with pot plants. You can invest in a few scented wild herbs and learn how best to use them for tea or medicine or flavour in your food. Otherwise, if you want to get more into the great outdoors and get engaged in nature and learning about wild foods, invest in a guidebook, whether it's famous plants or marine life, and start your journey very slowly, first learning how to ID your plant and seaweed species one at a time.
I think that's such good advice. I know I started birding when I was 10, and it's still a hobby that I have now, and I think that's one of the things that introduced me to nature in a more intimate way. But definitely starting with the IDing, I agree, is a really lovely way to get into it. I've done a couple of your courses, which has been through Veld and Sea, which has been really amazing. But I wanted to know, what role can foraging play in modern human life? For me, it's been a really interesting process, but how can it in turn, or can it in turn foster a connection or a reconnection to the self?
Well, I think collecting food from nature is something that's ingrained in us. It's in our genetic coding, in our memories, and our past. And foraging perhaps reactivate something that makes us feel alive. It triggers a sense of purpose and meaning. In modern day life, it allows us to see the value in what nature holds, and it opens up a sense of respect and awe within the natural world around us. What the edible landscape tastes like connects us back to the source of food, to the moon cycles and the seasons and the natural rhythms of things that we kind of forget about in our modern day lives. We humans are not separate from nature. We've come from nature and we are a part of it. Nature is alive, and when we step into that space, we become alive.
That's so magnificent. Thank you so much for sharing that. I've been thinking about this for a little while now, and I think perhaps it's important to ask you, but what is the importance of preserving plant and animal names in vernacular in South Africa?
Because that's where the origins are. The scientific names, I guess, are for taxonomy purposes. A lot of plant names will have quite similar common names, but quite a specific scientific name just for identification. But the vernacular names are of cultural importance. It's where the truth and the stories lie, the histories and the myths. Sometimes it gives us clues to edibility or medicine. And something too often forgotten are the first people using these foods, not just in the past, but in current day too. So this language needs to be remembered and passed on.
That's such an important message. Thank you so much for sharing that. And Roushanna, you don't only forage on land. You're well known for being seen gathering food and teaching people about the magic of seaweeds, especially in the intertidal zones and rock pools around Cape Town. So what are some of the key things you would like people to know about foraging, and specifically coastal foraging?
Oh, there's so many. Well, number one, seaweed is actually delicious. There's this misconception that seaweed is kind of stinky and not edible, just based on what you often experience walking along the beach, and all the seaweed is washed up on the shoreline, and that's what people generally first experience seaweed as. But if you step into the magical slice of intertidal zone that is exposed at a new moon or a full moon on spring tides, there's a whole sea garden to be explored, and there's all kinds of amazing sea vegetables. There's a lot of sustainability that needs to be practiced when harvesting these amazing nutritional seaweeds. There's lots of legal, sustainable, and responsible foraging practices, especially regenerative harvesting practices of seaweed. So, for instance, don't pull seaweed off the rock, cut them off with a pair of scissors so that the seaweeds can regenerate. Never collect from a polluted area, which is, unfortunately, those spaces are getting fewer and fewer around Cape Town. The further away from a city that you collect is better. Make sure you have a mollusk permit, which allows you to legally collect both shellfish and seaweeds. Those are just some of the little sprinklings of what to do with seaweed. It's a very exciting world once you step into it.
I was wondering how you would answer this question, because I know you've often said to me that you could talk for days about seaweed, and particularly kelp. So maybe
I'm reeling myself back in. I'm reeling myself in.
But Roushanna, perhaps to get a bit deeper, what do you see as the current biggest barrier to people being able to grow or forage their own food? And further, is foraging and growing your own food perhaps a romanticised notion in a country like South Africa, where perhaps we need more industrial agriculture? So what do you think needs to be done to increase food security and biodiversity protection?
Wow, where do we start? I think the biggest barrier is access to land, sure. Foraging is it's complicated because there's a lot of laws that apply in South Africa that don't apply overseas. So we might see very romantic pictures or images of people skipping around with baskets overseas collecting ingredients from the wild. But actually here in South Africa, we have very strict, stringent laws. So you're not allowed collecting anywhere that is privately owned land, that is sandparks land, that is forestry area. It's really only if you have permission from the landowner. So that's a huge barrier. Foraging is always romanticized. Even if you do have access to land and you are collecting ingredients, it's the picking part is the easiest. The preparing of your bulk is quite difficult. But at the end of the day, I think the answer to your question is knowledge. The knowledge needs to be passed down and ultimately needs to be introduced into our school's curriculum.
That would be incredible to see. I definitely would have enjoyed school more if we'd had some sort of discussions about this. I think that would have been really, really interesting.
And for food security and biodiversity protection, I think it all boils down to these wild crops being grown as farming crops. They are perfectly designed. These indigenous edible plants are perfectly designed for our South African climate. They're water-wise and they're delicious. So I think that needs to be maybe looked at a little bit. And seaweeds are another whole thing. I mean, collecting seaweeds from the intertidal zone is great for recreational use for yourself or for your family. But if it needs to go on a larger scale, then for commercial value, then it really, seaweeds do need to be farmed. That's an exciting space to look at as well. I mean, it's the cleanest form of marine aquaculture, and yeah, it just makes sense.
Thank you for bringing that up. Definitely something that we need to think about further. But I want to talk to you more about seaweeds, as always. And I've often heard you talking about this incredible untapped source of nutrition in seaweeds and its potential as a sustainable food source. So can you
Yes.
please talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, well, seaweeds around our South African coastline, we've got around 800 different species of seaweed. And there's only one that you can't eat. There's obviously choice edibles, and there's just seaweed that is edible, but maybe not doesn't taste so great. But it's almost like as diverse as our land plants are. It's a hugely overlooked and underutilized source of food and medicine when you look at the nutritional value. So seaweeds have a host of vitamins, minerals, micronutrients, all available in a colloidal and chelated form. So basically, they're designed for our bodies to absorb everything that they have to offer. It's, for want of a better word, they are a superfood, and we really should be including it more in our diets.
I know we've spoken about this, but really specifically, when does subsistence foraging become commercial farming? And is there a way, a best practice or a way that you've identified that this can be done most sustainably?
Sustainably for oneself or sustainably on a large scale?
I guess it would be, I think for oneself is perhaps a more romanticized notion. I'd like to know on perhaps a larger scale, because I think that puts the corporates and accountable for making these sorts of things accessible to most people.
Yes, yes. So the intertidal zone is a very, very delicate ecosystem. And even when we forage for seaweeds for ourselves for recreational use, we have to do it very mindfully and very, very carefully. And I'm talking about the smaller, softer seaweeds here. Then the kelp, which is obviously the biggest seaweed that we have here in South Africa, Eclonia maxima. That's much more sustainable to be foraging. The fastest growing, it's the largest seaweed that we have, but it also plays a very important role in our oceans. It's home and habitat for very small juvenile fish and little sea creatures. And so even just, the act of a fishing boat going in there and harvesting is a disturbance in itself. So I would say for commercial farming, I mean, for gathering seaweeds commercially, seaweed farms are the answer. We see it happening all over the world at the moment. It's actually booming at the moment. It just makes so much sense. It does need specific conditions, like we need specific coastal conditions to be able to have farms. A lot of our coastline is quite wild, but there are lots of places and spaces. I mean, that seaweed is being produced on farms already, but not for human consumption. It's just for feeding shellfish and sea life that is farmed commercially as well. But there's so many different ways of doing it. You get 3D vertical systems out in the open water. You can grow seaweeds in tanks. It does need a lot of work and science behind it to be able to mimic the ocean is very difficult. So if you can grow it out at sea, that's obviously the best. But yeah, it's the cleanest form of marine aquaculture, and if it's done right, it can increase food security and job creation.
And job creation is such an important topic, particularly in South Africa and emerging markets. So that would be
particularly in the fishing communities as well.
Absolutely, in aquaculture.
Yeah.
And then for those with the money and capacity, how can people protect these delicate ecosystems that are the last refuges of wild foraging? And who have you seen who is doing a really good job of this? And what other resources can you suggest that my listeners may learn more from?
Well, there's a lot of amazing things happening. I think policies in place for more, we're talking about the coastline now, policies in place for more marine protected areas are fantastic. There's the Sea Change project, of course. you're looking at land, then Kwatu Heritage Centre up the West Coast is incredible. If you haven't been there, please give it a visit. They've got amazing projects going on. If you want to read up about more information, there's quite a few books. Suggest going to Kirsten Bosch Gardens Book Centre. They've got a lot of amazing books. I've got a podcast that I can share with you. It's a Spotify mixed playlist. It's called Wild Food for Thought, and it's got all kinds of interesting information there. And then of course there's Protect the West Coast, a little project a big project that I've recently been up the West Coast this past weekend, and basically standing up for over 100 mining companies wanting to create all kinds of things up the West Coast, and then there's no access for anyone, let alone the Gurikwa traditional tribes up there. So that is something to look into for sure.
Thank you so much for mentioning all of those. And I have a really exciting thing to let you know. But next episode, I'm actually speaking to someone from the Sea Change Project.
Amazing.
So that's something exciting to look forward to.
Yeah.
And, Roushanna, I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time and for getting into these topics and explaining, some of these things that we're not talking about or that are not being discussed.
Yes.
And, for those listening, if you would like to follow more of Roushanna's work, you can find her on Instagram at Veld and Sea. That's VELDANDSEA. And on all sorts of other different social medias. So yes, Roushanna, my last question for you. Given your expertise, what question should I have asked you?
Maybe the first one would be, where can you join the Wildly Delicious Adventures? At the moment, the way that Veld and Sea works is that we track the edible landscape through the seasons. In wintertime now, it is mushroom foraging season, heading into wild food land foraging season. Then in springtime, it's all about the flowers, and we have flower workshops. And summertime is the time for seaweeds and coastal foraging. So seaweeds and coastal foraging, there's a season for it specifically. And there's the reason why we don't forage for seaweeds in the Southern Peninsula is for ecological reasons. If you go into the rock pools now, the seaweeds are very sparse in the rock pools. You get perennial and annual seaweeds, just like land plants. And in springtime, they actually start regrowing. In the wintertime, there's a lot of wave bashing action from our Cape winter storms, and a lot of the softer seaweeds get pulled up out of the rock pools. And there's lots of other creatures that rely on the seaweeds that are left over. So we really tend to leave the rock pools alone here in the Southern Peninsula over winter time. And then they also spore, a lot of them spore too. Then in springtime, they will start regrowing, and by midsummer, they will be full and lush and the garden is green again. Another quite commonly asked question is, what is the most delicious season? And that's very hard to choose. But right now, actually, this little window period offers some very delicious things. It's, as I mentioned, it's mushroom foraging season at the moment. So there's a lot of pine rings starting to pop up. There's still some boletus, some porcinis up and about. You can still access mussels and kelp. And then there's all the delicious wild greens starting, like the falkful, the trachyandra, the sauersuck, sulfirang. Yeah, it's really, really exciting. It's a very exciting and wildly delicious time right now.
Thank you for joining me today at Earthcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, please subscribe to this podcast and leave a review. Let's chat next episode, where I will be asking more creatives and intellectual disruptors about making decisions at the margin. See you next time.